group overview grows? Or have you ever thought that you were finally making progress, that you were finally winning the battle, but then something happened and suddenly you found yourself all the way back at the beginning, or maybe even worse off? It's enough to make even the strongest, most optimistic person feel defeated at times. And unfortunately, with panic, it's a very common experience. So common, in fact, that I even have a name for it. I call it the panic paradox, and it's the reason why you still have panic in your life. Today, I'll explain why the panic paradox happens, and then I'll give you a simple but counterintuitive technique that I've used with dramatic success with my own clients to officially start you on your journey back to a normal, panic-free life. This technique has been validated by multiple scientific trials, so we know that it works, and you can use it today to make an immediate difference in your life. Hi, I'm Michael Norman, and welcome to Panic Free TV. If you haven't watched the first 2 episodes in this series, I highly recommend that you take a few minutes and watch them now, as they'll make this video much more valuable to you and you'll get better results. If you have already watched the first 2 episodes, then you're ready for today. And what I'd like you to do to lay the foundation for the technique I'm going to be teaching you later in this episode is something very small, a little unusual, but very important. You see, there's a research finding that's one of the most important things you could ever learn about panic. And because it is so important, I want you to understand this fully, more than just intellectually, because this is an important step to setting you free. So what I'd like you to do as you're watching me right now is I want you to make sure that you don't think about a white bear. Don't think about a big white bear or a cute little white bear. In fact, don't think about any white bear at all. How are you going so far? Okay, so I haven't been very fair. I've been talking about white bears. I've been showing you white bears, which means you have to think about them. So to make this much fairer, I'm going to be quiet. I'm going to give you 10 seconds of thinking music. And if you want to also close your eyes so that you can fully focus, you can go ahead and do that too. Your only task is to not think about a white bear at all for 10 seconds. Try as hard as you can, use all the willpower you have, and try to not think about any white bear at all for the next 10 seconds. You ready? Let's start now. So, how did you go? Did you successfully stop any thoughts of white bears from entering your mind? If you're like the vast majority of us, trying to not think about a white bear makes it much more likely that you will. In other words, it's a strategy that guarantees failure. And as you're going to discover, as the research shows, this phenomena plays a central role in anxiety and panic. Now, this white bear experiment comes from the late Daniel Wegner, who was professor of psychology at Harvard University. In his study, he and his colleagues asked people to make sure that they didn't think about a white bear for 5 full minutes. That's 30 times longer than the short 10 seconds we just tried. What Wegner discovered was that, unsurprisingly, people couldn't suppress thoughts of a white bear. What was surprising, though, was that even after the experiment was over, even when people could think whatever they wanted, they ended up thinking about white bears far more than they would have normally. In other words, the act of trying to suppress a thought actually made it stronger, more tenacious, more frequent, and more enduring, even when the experiment was over. This phenomena, which Wegner called thought suppression, has been shown over and over again in the scientific literature. For example, in another study, when golfers were told not to overshoot, that's exactly what they were much more likely to do, to overshoot. And in a different study with soccer players, when they were instructed to avoid thinking about a penalty shot in a certain direction, they couldn't help keeping their eyes from looking at that forbidden spot. Ironically, the very act of trying to suppress a thought actually makes it much more likely that we'll get to have it. So why does this happen? Why does the white bear effect exist? It exists because in order for us to make sure that we're not thinking about something, some part of our brain has to think about it, which ironically keeps the thought alive. This is especially true when we're under what's called mental or cognitive load. Mental load just means your conscious mind is working really hard. It can come from having a lot on your mind or from engaging in a difficult mental task. It can also come from being distracted. And most relevant here, it can come from stress and anxiety. When we're stressed or anxious, trying to suppress a thought is even harder than normal. And so trying to not think about something makes it even more likely that we will. So how does this directly relate to panic? Well, if we think about it, what's one of the most common natural things that people do if they have a panicky thought? More often than not, they try to fight it. This is an incredibly natural, intuitive thing to do. Remember, as we covered in episode 2, a panic false alarm triggers the fight-flight response. Panic creates a natural urge to either try and escape the situation we're in, or it creates an urge to fight the panic itself. And what are the different ways we can try and fight panicky thoughts? Well, we can try to ignore them, forget them, debate them, eliminate them, distract ourselves from them, or in other words, we try to suppress them. It's a totally natural response. Any sensible person would do it. And unfortunately, more often than not, it backfires. Because of the white bear effect, trying to suppress panicky thoughts makes those thoughts stronger, more resilient, and more enduring. And because of this, it fuels the panic pattern. Last episode, we talked about the panic pattern, the core hidden pattern that's behind every panic false alarm. A panic attack happens when anxiety creates body sensations or anxious thoughts. And because our brain mistakenly learned to fear those body sensations or thoughts, that creates even more anxiety. This increased anxiety then creates even more of these body sensations and thoughts we're scared of, and around the cycle we go. I call this the panic pattern because it's the pattern behind every false alarm. It's a vicious cycle that can escalate into a full flight or fight response, and it is the recipe for panic. Panic doesn't require any danger whatsoever. All it requires is that our brain mistakenly fear the effects of anxiety as being dangerous, even though there is no danger. So what happens if we have panic-related thoughts and we try to suppress them? Well, as the white bear effect predicts, it tends to make those thoughts stronger, more resilient, and more enduring. That creates more anxiety, and having more anxiety leads to more anxious thoughts, and it's like adding fuel to the fire of the panic pattern. One of my heroes, the late Paul Václavic, was a psychologist who believed that it's the way we innocently try and solve our problem with panic that ends up keeping panic in our lives or making it even worse. He called solutions that backfire attempted solutions, and modern research shows he was right. What we've been talking about, trying to suppress anxious thoughts, trying to force them to go away, thinking that it helps, this is just one of several very common attempted solutions for panic that backfire. The problem with thought suppression, like all other attempted solutions, is that intuitively it makes sense. This makes it very appealing. It seems like the most intelligent thing to do. If you don't want something, you try to get rid of it. That works in the physical world, and yet in the mental world, because of the white bear effect, unfortunately, it backfires. Now, because thought suppression plays such a central role in anxiety and panic, I think it's really important that I quickly talk about two of the more subtle forms that are very common. Subtle thought suppression strategy number 1, trying to logically debate or change unwanted thoughts. Stephen Hayes is professor of psychology at the University of Nevada. And while he and I have different approaches, We share very similar philosophies. One thing that he's been very passionate about, along with other researchers such as Neil Jacobson from the University of Washington and John Teasdale from Cambridge University in the UK, is that trying to logically change unwanted thoughts not only doesn't help, but it can actually backfire and makes things worse. Now, if you've heard of CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, you might find this surprising. CBT is one of the most popular therapies because it's very simple, so anyone can learn to do it as a therapist, and it's easy to research. And for clients, most people with panic find at least some improvement over the course of 10 to 20 to 30 sessions of therapy. This has made a lot of people think that trying to use logic to combat anxious thoughts is a useful strategy. That's what CBT seems to be about in its most stereotypical form: challenging, disputing, and logically debating so-called negative thoughts. However, as research has been done into the individual components of CBT, what we've discovered is it's not these logical parts that are the reason why CBT helps some people. When CBT works, it works for completely different reasons. There is absolutely no evidence that trying to logically challenge or change unwanted thoughts does anything of value. But there is evidence that it can trigger the white bear effect. So what can you take away from all of this? Well, perhaps the most important thing to remember is that, to paraphrase Jonathan Haidt when he was at the University of Virginia, when it comes to how our brains work, the emotional dog wags the rational tail. Because the panic mistake happens deep in the unconscious parts of our brain, it's not a logical, rational mistake. And because of this, the answers to panic are also not logical, nor are they rational. Real change doesn't come from head knowledge. It comes from something much, much deeper. It comes from real, tangible, lasting, emotional shifts. When you feel safe, secure, and calm in the very situations which used to make you feel anxious, then your thoughts automatically are different. And there's no need to try and fight with them, with logic, or with anything else. A second way a lot of people try to suppress anxious thoughts is by trying to continually distract themselves or preoccupy themselves with other things. Like all other attempted solutions, distraction is understandable because in the short term, it can seem as if it's working. The problem is that trying to keep busy or continually divert your attention away from anxious thoughts, that's tiring. And when we get tired or lose concentration, that's when the white bear effect can really kick in. The unwanted thoughts can come back stronger and more intensely, and that can trigger panic. So the take-home message here is that distraction techniques are at best short-term band-aids that create long-term problems. They don't help correct the panic mistake. And unfortunately, because of the white bear effect, in the long run, trying to just keep busy or distract yourself tends to just make panic worse. There are several other very common attempted solutions for panic which seem like good ideas, but which actually backfire and make panic worse. Since this episode is already too long, we don't have time to cover them all here, but I do very briefly want to cover one more because it fits in with what we've been talking about already today. Just as Daniel Wegner's white bear research is showing that trying to suppress anxious thoughts can make these thoughts even stronger and more resilient, James Gross from Stanford University has found a similar thing with emotion. Gross found that trying to fight against or control unwanted emotions is not only tiring and stressful, but it also can prime the fight-flight response that's behind panic. This means that just like trying to suppress anxious thoughts backfires, so does trying to suppress or control panic-related body sensations or emotions. In other words, trying to fight panic in any way is fuel for the panic pattern, and it makes panic worse. Are you starting to appreciate why the panic paradox exists? What common sense tells us should work with panic usually makes things worse. And what does work, as you'll soon discover, tends to fly in the face of common sense. Panic is deeply counterintuitive, and because of that, so too are the solutions. Now, I hope by now you've realized my bias. I passionately believe that science matters. I grew up in a pretty unique environment. My father was recognized by the government as being one of the top 10 medical scientists in the country. And because of that, for as long as I can remember, I grew up surrounded by some of the best researchers on the planet. One of my father's friends even won a Nobel Prize in medicine, and it all impacted me incredibly deeply. It's why I believe that when reality is counterintuitive, as it is with panic, we need to rely on careful science. Science really matters, and thankfully, because the research we have into panic is deep and robust, we already have the answers you need that can set you free. No matter how bad your situation has been, no matter how long you've had panic in your life, all you need is the right approach and you can be free. So what is the right approach? Well, the first step that I want to introduce you to today, just to get you thinking, is a counterintuitive strategy that reverses the attempted solutions we've been talking about. Since trying to fight against panicky thoughts or emotions fuels them and makes them stronger, it makes sense to be curious. What's the opposite of trying to fight something? Encouraging it? Helping it? When it comes to panic, that sounds completely crazy, doesn't it? Why would anyone want to encourage or help a panic attack? Well, let me share with you a quick story that puts this all in an even wider perspective. Nearly 2 decades ago, after a long day reading research in the university library for a postgraduate neuroscience project that I was doing, I was tired, and so I took a break. Out of curiosity, I started browsing other books and journals, and what I stumbled on changed my life forever. I came across a collection of scientific papers written by the American psychiatrist and scientist Milton Erickson. Now, Erickson is widely recognized as the greatest therapist of all time. And from the moment I read his work, I was hooked. A few months later, I won a dream PhD scholarship that I had always wanted, and I immediately turned it down. Nothing could hold my attention fully except Erickson's work. I knew I'd found my mission, and because of that, nothing else mattered anymore. Erickson wrote up many amazing case studies from his career, but one of them in particular triggered my thinking about how to work with panic. He was sent an angry, defiant, out of control 8-year-old boy called Joe. Now, nobody could control Joe. Joe had destroyed all kinds of things at home. He had destroyed things at school. He'd broken neighbors' windows, and his mother had tried every kind of punishment she could think of. Nothing had worked. So when Joe came into Erickson's office, proclaiming that he was going to stomp the floor as hard as he could, so that he could prove that no one could control him, how would you have responded? Think about it. Most of us would have tried common sense. We might have tried to reason with him or persuade him. We might have tried to threaten him or punish him, but none of those things had worked. So, as Erickson usually did, he did the opposite of what anyone would have expected. He encouraged Joe to go ahead and to stomp as hard as he could. After 30 stomps, with Erickson encouraging him every stomp along the way, Joe was exhausted. So he took a break just to stand, and Erickson encouraged that too. In fact, he encouraged Joe to see how long he could stand. But even standing can get tiring for an 8-year-old boy. So after a while, Joe sat down, completely exhausted. And because Erickson had been on his side all along, because he hadn't tried to fight him, Erickson and Joe formed a close relationship, and Joe's behavior changed dramatically from that point on throughout his life. No matter how angry a person is, they can't stomp forever. That's why, paradoxically, what's much more helpful than trying to fight panic is trying to encourage it, trying to help it, trying to make it stronger. Now, I know even with all we've talked about, this might still seem a little crazy. Again, as I've pointed out many times, panic is completely counterintuitive. So if you're still skeptical, that's totally fine. This is just to plant a seed inside your mind, a different way of thinking. If the first time I see a client, if they're having a panic false alarm because they've had to travel or get out of their comfort zone, I don't ask them to relax. Instead, I ask them to voluntarily make their panic a lot bigger. I ask them to voluntarily give me the biggest panic attack they've ever had. And what happens universally is they can't. Paradoxically, it relaxes them. This experience, the experience that panic doesn't work the way we think, is a very powerful first step on the journey back to freedom. Now, if you, like me, care about scientific evidence, thankfully, we have multiple randomized controlled trials investigating paradoxical approaches like this. That's the highest form of evidence in science, and it shows that trying to encourage panic can indeed be an effective first step. Now, there are a lot of nuances about how to implement this strategy, and this strategy is just a tiny part of a much bigger system. The reason we covered it today is just to plant a seed inside your mind. A seed that says, hey, maybe panic doesn't work the way I thought it did. And if you grasp that, that's what I really care about for right now. Because it means, whether you realize it or not, that you've already taken the hardest step. You realize that panic doesn't follow the rules that most people think it does. And that is a big deal. And if you get this, then you're on the journey back to freedom. A journey that can be surprisingly fast with the right systematic approach. And we do need to be systematic because there are multiple dimensions to panic, and we need to address them all. Luckily, my other techniques are far more gentle than trying to encourage panic, but everything has the same focus. Prevention is much better than cure. That's the whole focus in everything I do. Panic-free isn't about coping better with panic attacks, because that means you still have them. It doesn't even mean that you're able to immediately stop a panic attack as soon as it begins, because at best, that's just a good start. What panic-free really means is that panic has truly become a total non-issue for you in your life. It means that you're as naturally, effortlessly, panic-free, carefree, and normal as anyone else you know, without you even having to think about it. And the good news is that if you have the right system, you can be panic-free very quickly, even if you've had panic for a very long time. And that is what the next episode is all about. Thank you so much for watching this episode. I hope you've noticed that this is already making an important difference in your life. Please enjoy the show notes. I try to be very thorough with them so that you can review them anytime. And I'd love to hear what's helped you the most. It means a lot to me to hear your feedback, so please leave your comments below. I hope you have a great day, and I'll see you in the next episode. Thank you so much for watching.